Vaccines, coronavirus vaccines, should they be compulsory? Should they not be compulsory? I'm actually going to go here because it's topical and I don't particularly like talking about this, but people will expect me to talk about it and may even want me to talk about it and hear my thoughts given what happened this last week. So we know that Oxford University are one of about 160, 170 odd people around the world trying to develop a COVID-19 vaccine. The government's entered into an agreement to get 25 million doses if those trials prove effective in people, and the Prime Minister told 3AW radio in Melbourne that it would be mandatory. People freaked out as a result of that, and the medical establishment said it would probably be lower uptake because people would become suspicious if it was mandatory, and the Prime Minister has backed away, the government's backed away, and so on. I don't know whether it was just a slip of the tongue or whatever. I don't know all the motives in there, and I'm not going to cast any aspersions, but I just want to say it's good. I'm happy about that he's backed away. Because the question arises, should the vaccine be mandatory? And I think this can be answered regardless of whether you are anti-vax, pro-vax, or something in between. I am not anti-vax, and I say absolutely that this should not be mandatory. With matters like this, we must always turn the issue into a question of principle to find out whether it's a good idea. The issue at hand is simple. It's saying, well, can we stop coronavirus through vaccinating people? And, should we get everybody to take the vaccine because it's important? It's something like that. But the principle at work, the broader principle that the precedent this creates for actions in the future is really something broader. It goes like this. It is, should governments forcibly inject people with medicine against their will? Is that a good idea? Is it a good idea to set that precedent, to create that possibility? And as a question of principle, the answer has to be no. And it must be no because coercion like that sets a bad example. That's a principle of coercion, an example that could be abused tyrannically in the wrong circumstances in a very serious and severe way. Now, many people scoff at that. Many people can't see the logic in that. Many people are very happy to heap up more and more power for their governments and give them these precedents in times that are good, like these times that we're in now, or for times of freedom, like the ones we live in at the moment to some degree. But those people who don't have concern over this, they are ignorant of human nature, or they haven't thought carefully about human nature. They haven't thought carefully they're ignorant about the nature of power itself, and they're ignorant of history. The only reason it seems far-fetched in Australia today is because we've lived in unusual times for quite a while now. Unusual times brought about by something of a historical anomaly, which is a society of people who believe in broad personal freedoms and limited government power, and they have diligently and zealously fought for those values for centuries. I assure you, if we give away that diligence and that zeal, it will not be long before those old changeless forces I mentioned, the true nature of power, that it corrupts, human nature itself, that it is corrupt and takes advantage of power for wrong ends, and historical norms, the fact that societies mostly have been more tyrannical than free. Those things, it won't be long before we just revert back to the inertia of those things and the drag of those things. You need to be fighting against those things to keep the principle of freedom alive. That's a historical anomaly. It's unusual. It takes people power. And everybody, doesn't matter whether you're hard left, it doesn't matter whether you're hard right, it doesn't matter whether you're in between. Everybody believes that there are evil people who strive for power. And in fact, that might even be a feature of many evil people, that they do strive for power. And sometimes in history, at different eras, in free societies, in democratic societies, in whatever the society is, all kinds of societies, all parts of the world, sometimes they get that power. And the important thing, therefore, is this. The scope of power, when they do get it, needs to be such that when someone does get it, the damage they can cause is minimized. And that damage, that the scope of that power can be limited by rules, but it can also be limited by expectations. It can be limited by what people are prepared to put up with. Because, of course, the expansion of power happens slowly. And sometimes people need to act sooner than they do to reject an expansion of power. Forced medical treatment and injections really is not a good place to be when evil people are in power, as continued to happen and has happened throughout history. And for these reasons, the government should pursue all alternatives first. We haven't tried voluntary. Indeed, voluntary vaccination, I would imagine, would be taken up by the vast majority of people in the present circumstances. Is it even necessary to do mandatory? Why go there? Other strategies to manage the virus need to be tried first. See how we go with voluntary, and also see how the virus goes. It doesn't. One of the questions I can't get answered, by the way, is the fact that even in somewhere like Sweden, which is effectively no lockdown, they had some measures but not many, and they had one of the worst death rates per million population in the world. Still, 99.95% of people survived. And it's not over yet, I know, but gosh, they're through the wave. And I sit there and I go, well, hang on, is that even a pandemic? This is the crazy thing. No one's answering these questions. No one's, you're mostly getting shouted at and told that you hate people and all the rest of it, and no one's answering the questions. Is there really a broader picture here that we can look at, which makes the idea of mandatory vaccination seem just like full-on overkill? But above all, broad personal liberties and limited government power is important for the long-term security and peace of any society. It really is. Now, 2 footnotes to make to what I just said. The first one is the government's actually made the situation harder for themselves because they've got behind a vaccine from the Oxford University crew that has a genuine ethical problem attached to it. As I said, I am not anti-vax. Indeed, I am, and I'm sorry for those who get upset by this. I'm quite pro-vax in most cases, in the sense that I think vaccines are a marvel of medical technology, and that vaccines, you think of things like polio, you think of things like diphtheria, you think of things that have, diseases that have ravaged young children and people prior to the invention of vaccines, which have helped to eradicate those diseases, has been an extraordinary thing. And so vaccines pose a great good in many circumstances, But there are some vaccines, and the number of them is mercifully small in Australia, which are genuinely different. I can certainly see how they attract legitimate ethical questions. In fact, it's not that they actually do. Let's just face it, they do attract ethical questions because the research and development process which helped create them makes use of cells which are historically associated with abortion. They do not contain aborted fetus cells. There's a lot of misunderstanding on that and people who just aren't reading sources correctly or whatever. But the research and development process associated with them, or the research and development process that created them is associated with cells, which originally, some decades ago, originated from aborted fetuses. Now, that's the most succinct way that I can put it without an entire segment, but you see how that this class of vaccines is an ethical flag because, say, in 1962, an aborted fetus, some tissue from that fetus was used to develop a cell, and then that cell's been replicated for many decades, many millions of times, and here we are ages later, and you're buying these cells off the shelf. But way back, they came from an aborted fetus. That's the problem. It doesn't go into the vaccine, but the vaccine is developed with the help of it. That is an ethical problem. And the government's chosen Oxford University vaccine is one of those offending vaccines. Like I said, in Australia, for many, there is an ethical alternative because these cell lines don't just come from fetuses, they come from vegetables, they come from tissues of animals and humans and all sorts. And so you get plenty of different kinds of vaccines. There's a few where there's no alternatives. But sadly, this Oxford University vaccine is one. And so it kind of makes it really difficult. Of all the bad luck, this particular vaccine, which is most advanced, they happen to have chosen this HEK 230 something, 234 or whatever cell line, which ultimately traces its origins way back to the 1960s with an aborted fetus, an electively aborted fetus. So that is a real shame. Now, second footnote. Some people have objected to my comments in this vein because they say that they're not, it's not Christian analysis, it's not, it's just politics or it's just right-wingism or something like this. Okay, let me show you that in fact it is Christian analysis. And I'll deal with that, in about 60 seconds. Broad personal freedoms and limited government power is the best guarantee that we have as Christians that we can live authentically Christian lives without interference, okay? In 1 Timothy 2, the Apostle Paul calls on us to pray for the governing authorities. Why? Well, he says, so that the godly life might be a life of peace. I guess that's a kind of religious freedom, right? So we live godly lives, all the things God calls us to do, and we do it peacefully. That's the prayer. But why does that matter? Is that because we care about ourselves, because we just want the government to get off our backs and, it's all about individualism? No, not at all. It matters because God desires all people everywhere to come to a knowledge of the truth. It matters for the sake of others. Now, all of that is straight from the scripture, 1 Timothy 2. Now, a godly life, what is it? Well, it's a life in which we're lights in the world and we're seen as such publicly. A godly life is a life in which we're the salt of the earth. We're fighting against compromise and evil and the decay that it creates in society. A godly life is a life in which we raise our families in the fear of the Lord. A godly life is a life in which we serve our churches. A godly life is a life in which we're good witnesses to Christ in our lives. It's a life in which we evangelize. And you know what that means if we're free to do that, if that godliness is free and unpunished and uninhibited in society, if the government's not getting in the way and not passing laws to make it illegal and to limit it and curtail it, if that's all good, well, what that means is that people come to a knowledge of the truth and are saved, which is God's desire, as Paul says in 1 Timothy 2. That's why the prayer is even being made. Because our lives are godly and they are left by the governing authorities to be lives of peace, and other people see, encounter, and hear the truth. And whenever a government gets too much power, and we're seeing this today more and more, I regret to say, one of the first things to come under pressure is the godly life. Whether in our families, our preaching, our public witness, the words we speak, the values we hold dear, everything from, all these new sort of woke laws like hate speech laws, which is a misnomer, they're not about hate speech, or conversion therapy laws, which is a misnomer, they're not about conversion therapy. One of the effects they have is to place pressure on these very things. The truth we speak. The Christian lives that are being lived. They attack and undermine those very things. And so do you know what? Freedom matters. Keeping the government in its rightful place matters. It really does. And I believe the freedom to conscientiously object on pro-life grounds to those small number of vaccines that are ethically dubious or for which there is no ethical alternative, whether you personally ultimately agree with that ethical objection or not. And Christians fall on both sides, because when you go into the research and development stuff, it's all there's a lot to work through. And the biotech industry is big, and it doesn't just deal with vaccines; it deals with all kinds of medical treatments, which we all encounter all the time, and they're all tainted, sadly, by this kind of thing. But regardless of where you fall on the issue, the ability to conscientiously object on pro-life grounds matters. It matters. And so therefore, freedom does matter. And that is, I believe, something that every wise Christian, when it comes to governing authority, really needs to be concerned about. So that was the truth of it, about whether or not a COVID-19 vaccine should be mandatory. Hey guys, make sure you click like to like the video, or hit the subscribe button down here and click on the bell so you don't miss any notifications. And to watch more videos, just click here. Cheers. Go on, click one. You know you want to.